Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. On the show tonight, health officials are sounding the alarm about a trifecta of upper respiratory illnesses hitting just in time for winter. What you need to know.
There's one individual I will not endorse, and that is Lori Lightfoot.
Alderman Ray Lopez drops out as the race for mayor heats up. Analysis from our Spotlight Politics team.
The Chicago Board of Elections misses a deadline to make all polling locations accessible. How disability advocates are reacting.
Thanksgiving's tomorrow, but for many Native Americans, it's also recognized as the National Day of Mourning. We talk about the difficult history behind the holiday.
We can share what we have with others through dance.
Take a trip to the tropics by way of Jefferson Park with a local couple sharing their love of Polynesian culture and dance.
And with the holiday season beginning, we visit a local poinsettia farm to find out how the flame red shrub became the unofficial houseplant of Christmas.
But first, some of today's top stories. An 18-year-old has been charged in connection with a deadly traffic collision on the near South Side. Prosecutors say Kendall Sprouts was driving more than twice the speed limit when he crashed into a vehicle that was attempting to flee a traffic stop. 22-year-old Kayshawn Javon Gray was killed. 6 others were injured. Sprouts has been charged with reckless homicide involving a motor vehicle and aggravated reckless driving. There's more on this story on our website.
Uptown's Weiss Memorial and West Suburban hospitals passed another hurdle in the switch to a new owner. This despite the current owner filing for bankruptcy just last month. The Chicago Tribune reports that California-based Pipeline Health has reached an agreement with Resilience Healthcare and Ramco Healthcare Holdings to take over operations December 2nd. Pipeline has owned the hospital since 2019. The agreement still has to be approved by the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District.
Illinois is seeing statewide job growth. More than 190,000 new jobs were reported across the state from October of last year to October this year. That's in non-farm jobs, according to state data. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate decreased in 12 of Illinois' 14 metropolitan areas. Rockford seeing the highest decrease of 1.3%, now sitting at a 5.9% unemployment rate. The statewide unemployment rate is 4.3%.
And coming up in the program, we talk with local Native Americans and their thoughts on Thanksgiving.
But up next, pediatric care centers under siege by a trifecta of respiratory illness. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
U.S. health officials are sounding the alarm about a trifecta of upper respiratory illnesses hitting just in time for winter. You've got the persistent and stubborn problem of RSV in infants, the COVID Omicron variant, and the seasonal flu. And health officials are worried that pediatric care centers might not be ready for the onslaught. And joining us are Dr. Julie Fitzgerald, practicing pediatrician and critical care physician at Loyola University Medical Center, and Dr. Allison Bartlett, associate professor of pediatric infectious diseases at U Chicago Medicine. Thank you both for joining us. I know it's been a very busy time the last few weeks for both of you. Parents of small children are very familiar with RSV, but remind us what RSV is and what the symptoms are.
So RSV is respiratory syncytial virus, and it's probably one of the most common cough and cold viruses that children experience. In the Chicago area, I'd say almost every child at some point in time experiences RSV, and it'll present at the start like every other cold that your children may experience.
And these symptoms linger for a very long time. Julie Fitzgerald, Dr. Fitzgerald, Dr. Bartlett, what are you seeing at Lurie right now in terms of patient capacity?
So I'm at Comer Children's, and what we're seeing in terms of capacity is actually the same as all the other hospitals in the area are seeing, and that is we have been at 100% capacity essentially since the beginning of September, with both overwhelmed emergency rooms, inpatient general pediatrics units, and our ICUs.
Dr. Fitzgerald, what are you seeing over at Loyola right now? I know you've been working around the clock for the last few days.
Yeah, we're seeing very similar to what Dr. Bartlett just explained. It's a statewide problem. If you think about the pediatric resources within the state of Illinois, there's less than 300 pediatric intensive care unit beds for the entire state. And there's many areas within the state that have no pediatric coverage whatsoever. So places like Chicago and the larger children's hospitals are getting inundated right now with all these children who have severe respiratory illness.
Dr. Bartlett, how do you manage this specifically if you're at or near capacity with ICU beds or general pediatric beds?
It has been quite a challenge, and again, our hospital is not unique in the state or in the country, unfortunately, pulling out all the stops and trying to make as much extra capacity as we can. Everything from opening up extra fast-track emergency room spaces in our inpatient clinics, and seeing if we can't have our adult colleagues accept some of our 17 and 18-year-old patients, expanding beds for the pediatric ICU. But unfortunately, one of the other problems that we're butting up against is nursing and respiratory therapy staffing shortages.
Okay, so a confluence of problems here, and health leaders are calling for an emergency response nationwide. What do you think that should entail?
I think it's going to need to entail healthcare providers on every level, from the community hospital pediatricians in their own clinics to urgent care centers to community hospitals and the university healthcare systems and freestanding children's hospitals. We are going to need physician support. We're going to need an increase in nursing support and respiratory therapy support, as well as supply chain, getting the supplies that we need to care for these children, because we need smaller equipment, as well as pharmacy. We're running into drug shortages for the meds that these children desperately need to help them.
So it sounds like a coordinated response here is needed, akin to what was going on in the beginning of COVID.
It's very, very similar. It's very, very similar, and we at least had a little bit of a dry run with COVID, and now we're applying a lot of what we learned through the original pandemic to our pediatric experience.
And Dr. Bartlett, now we have Thanksgiving, where many people are going to be gathering in close quarters, holiday parties, general revelry. How concerned are you for the further spread of this virus and COVID and flu?
Yeah, I think that, at least in the Chicagoland area, it looks like RSV had reached its peak and is heading down. But as you mentioned, as we get together with family from other areas, there's absolutely the risk of another spike with RSV. Influenza, we know over the past couple of weeks, has been just going, crazy high throughout the area. And so that's actually my bigger concern at the moment. And then COVID is starting to creep up. And so I'm prepared for that to increase as well. And I'm worried about our teams that have been working tirelessly for now, 2 or 3 months of just running on full steam, and we're getting tired.
Dr. Fitzgerald, what about that? I mean, it seems like a fall wave of COVID never really materialized, but are you monitoring the situation after Thanksgiving for those very reasons, staffing shortages, bed shortages?
Exactly, and we're already seeing COVID cases in small children in our intensive care unit, in our emergency rooms. We do have concerns about what the travel over the holiday will bring us, but we're ready. We're ready as we can be.
And it sounds like like you said, you've been mobilizing for several months because of RSV. Dr. Bartlett, you mentioned that influenza is a lot higher this year. What's causing that?
So I think it's our standard seasonal influenza. It just happened to start earlier this year. I don't think we have a wonderful understanding of why, but certainly the fact that we are sort of out and about and not using these preventative measures that we were using in the height of COVID is contributing. And now we have a big vulnerable population who may not have gotten their flu vaccines yet this year. And so we're seeing rampant spread of influenza.
So you have flu vaccines that are down, and then only 11% of Americans have taken that fourth Omicron bivalent booster. How do you think the country can get those rates up?
I think education for parents, for families, really getting the truth out there that these vaccines are safe, these vaccines are effective, and that they can save your child's life. It's incredibly important to get all of your kids vaccinated as soon as possible.
And Dr. Bartlett, given what you're seeing at Lurie and hospitals across the country, what is your advice to folks that are preparing to get together for Thanksgiving?
So again, I'm down at Comer, but the advice is the same. Really,
I'm sorry, Comer.
It is to get together. That's okay. To get together safely. We actually have changed our family's Thanksgiving plans. I'm here at my parents' house up in Wisconsin, and my brother and his family have the flu. And so unfortunately, as much as we all want to get together, now is not the right time. So we are unfortunately making that sort of family decision for the safety of everybody.
All right, decisions that all families, I'm sure, are making right now. Doctors Allison Bartlett, Julie Fitzgerald, thank you so much for being here. Stay healthy and safe.
Great. Thanks, Paris.
Thank you.
And now to Amanda with a look at how Indigenous Americans are spending the Thanksgiving holiday. Amanda.
Paris, thank you. Thanksgiving is tomorrow, bringing family and friends together across the country. But for many Native Americans, it's recognized as the National Day of Mourning. Joining us now with more on the difficult history behind the holiday and what it means for local Native Americans are Anthony Michael Temez, member of the Chuy Nation's Youth Council, and Nikki McDade-Berry, PhD candidate in Learning Sciences at Northwestern University, also incoming Assistant Professor of Environmental Justice Education at UCLA. So, first of all, Nikki, congrats on that new position that you will soon be undertaking. Share more about your tribal affiliations, please.
Sure. So, bana na nanaha so naibi na diva na Nikki McDade-Berry na tutone diasan banaita na botona naita. So, my name is Zoe Naibi, which is the name my grandfather Albert Ballard gave to me. You may call me Nikki McDade-Berry. I am from the Shoshone-Bannock tribes of Fort Hall, Idaho, and I'm also of Paiute and Irish descent.
Well, thanks for joining us here. And Anthony, I'm going to pose that same question to you, please.
Of course. Bujua ni iskrede nini indijnakaj iskagunin jujaba amiknadudum. Hello, my name is Anthony Michael Temez. I'm First Nations Cree, Sichanga Lakota, and Black. And I am a member of the Chuy Nations Youth Council.
Which is what exactly?
A Native American Youth Council located here in the city of Chicago to create safe space for Native youth through arts, activism, and education.
Now, Anthony, I'm going to start with you because you are the youth. And for a lot of people, I think Thanksgiving really begins with learning, maybe in kindergarten class or some such, where a lot of American children are maybe, cut up a brown paper bag with fringe and wear construction paper feathers on their heads. And that's the introduction to Thanksgiving. What do people, young children, adults, get wrong about that original story?
Of course. So I remember when I was in school, elementary school, and in my classroom and teachers doing that, cutting up the paper hats and making the headdresses out of construction paper. And so I think a lot of the times that we put this myth out there that Thanksgiving was a time where Native Americans and Pilgrims came together and had a happy meal and kind of sat down and discussed what they were thankful for, when really, that's not what happened. We look and we have to see what happened 50 years after Thanksgiving. We have to look at the war that ensued after Thanksgiving, and we have to look what they did to the Pequot people as well. They took them from their homelands, marched them, and essentially banished them from their homes. So we're oftentimes fed this mythical narrative of Native Americans and Pilgrims coming together when that is not at all what happened.
And Nikki, I understand that you have children who are in school now. So is this still the case? Are there still those feather headdresses made of construction paper and this, I don't know if you would characterize it as romanticized, incomplete, what version of Thanksgiving is taught in school these days? Is that still the case?
I mean, it depends on what part of the nation that you're in. Of course, there are parts that are still promulgating the myth that Anthony spoke about, but also now a lot of times people are trying to do something different and better. But what happened with my kids, for example, is that they just didn't talk about it at all. So my kids learned nothing about Thanksgiving this year, except for the fact that they get a week off school for it. So it's really a shame because it is an opportunity to teach kids, a real history of the United States that they are actually prepared to handle, but they don't.
So nothing at all, no recognition or nod to Thanksgiving. What do you believe children should learn?
Well, as an educator, I think they should learn the truth. And in conversation with various schools about this, I have heard the pushback that, well, it's a really hard history for kids to learn about genocide. And it is, but it's something that we don't have the privilege of not learning about. We know our histories from when we're quite young. My kids know those histories, and for them to be ignored or for a whitewashed version of it to be told is actually harmful to Native children. And then, the ignorance that it promulgates for all children is also a problem.
So, Anthony, a couple of questions here. For starters, when you were in school and this occurred, did you feel, was it incumbent on you to speak up? Or obviously that's a lot of pressure to put on anybody, but particularly somebody who's young.
Yeah, I often found myself speaking out against the teacher from kindergarten all the way through high school, even in college, just educating my peers on Native issues and Native culture. But oftentimes when, we get to November, Native people in the classroom or in our workspaces, we often turn into the Indian expert, right? People come to us and say, oh, well, what do you know about Native people? And while I can only speak to what I know about my tribes or my tribal affiliations, people expect you to know everything about Native people. And so it often puts a big burden on us to answer all of these questions, because I think for myself, I don't want to let my classmates down, but it's also important for them to know, like, Native people are not a monolith. We are, there's over 500 plus Native nations, all very different from each other. And so I think that's important that they know that. But also during this time, Native people can turn into that, like, monoculture. Like, people just view us as one separate
Native
thing.
Americans.
Like Native Americans, yeah.
And there is, of course, a large indigenous population here in Chicago. I know there is a legislative effort, and I'm not sure which of you can speak to this, to teach more of that history, require it in Illinois schools.
Yeah. So right now, a group of people, including the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative, are working toward building out legislation statewide that would require history being taught about Native peoples, particularly Native peoples who are local here, but also nationwide through K-12. And part of that also involves not just teaching about us from pre-1900, which tends to be the case, and that kind of promulgates a myth that we don't exist anymore, which, the amount of times if I had $1 for every time somebody said, oh, you're Native, I didn't realize they were a thing anymore.
Around.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and then another part of it that is really, really important that we're hoping gets pushed through is that there's professional development pieces. So, because we can't just put out a curriculum and then expect teachers can just do it. We have to actually help teachers know how to implement them and how to talk about these tough subjects, particularly when most teachers are not Native themselves.
And Nikki, I don't want to let this segment end, however, without asking, of course, tomorrow is Thanksgiving.
Right.
What do you do on that day? Do you recognize it?
Sure. Well, I know for a lot of Native people, a lot of us will still have a Thanksgiving dinner because it's a time to come together for our, with our families and friends. And it's something that we've been doing since time immemorial anyway for our harvests. We're all celebrating harvests right now across the nation, really, and so it is something that we'll do anyway. But some people still choose not to. Like, I won't be celebrating tomorrow. We'll be doing some other things, upholding our relations with lands instead.
Do it on your own time, and same with you, Anthony.
Yeah, I think
just
it's
briefly here, but
yeah, I think it's just a time for people to recognize and celebrate tribal sovereignty. We look at what we did here in the city of Chicago, where they turned land back to Native people at the First Nations Garden. All of that is very important, so Natives are able to stay connected to their cultures.
Well, my gratitude to each of you for being with us and sharing your experiences. Once again, that is Anthony Michael Timas and Nikki McDade-Berry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, how a local dance academy can help you get in a warm weather state of mind. Stay with us.
Do you think there's been sort of a rethinking of how those events happened here in Chicago?
I made a promise to myself in my career that every year I would make a piece of art dedicated to the memory.
Got into a zone of mentor to children. See what we can do to kind of elevate each other. We all we got at this point.
I'm using my past to push forward, to build a movement to create the world that we all want to see.
During the darkest days of winter, pretty much every Chicagoan has dreamed of balmy island breezes in a Polynesian paradise. But if a trip to Tahiti isn't in the cards for you this year, the dancers at Hokulea Academy can deliver a taste of the tropics by way of Jefferson Park. Producer Erica Gunderson has this hip-swinging story.
Hawaiian hula is storytelling, and it really goes back. For the Hawaiians, it was a way of record keeping before there was a written language.
In stage performances and in the studio, Ale Gabino and David Acevedo tell their love story through dance.
We actually met at a Polynesian dance competition in Hawaii, and it was there when we became friends. We started talking.
I loved seeing him do what he loves to do, so I really enjoy when he dances and we dance together.
Gabino, a native of Mexico, and Acevedo, who grew up in Chicago, are both lifelong dancers. 6 years after meeting in Hilo, Hawaii, they married in 2009. A year later, they opened Hokulea Academy of Polynesian Arts, where together they teach their other great love, the love of Polynesian culture and dance.
Left, left, out, two. In Mexico, I feel like a family gathering. Everybody eats, everybody dances, and play games, stuff like that. So that's something that I saw in the Polynesian culture, that they are very family-oriented. It's all about the family. Polynesian dancing, it goes very deep into connecting to everything in nature, their ancestors, the land that they live in.
And Hokulea's professional division performs all over the city, like at this community event in Albany Park. They say their aim is not only to entertain, but also to educate.
They had no GPS or not really any maps other than the stars in the sky and the bird migration patterns.
When Ale decided to move to Chicago, there was other Polynesian groups around and things like that, but what we really noticed is nothing was giving that authenticity that we would see in the islands. So as the story goes, if it doesn't exist, you create it.
Our main focus out of all of the Polynesian cultures are Hawaii and Tahiti. When you go to a luau in Hawaii, they represent all of the cultures, all of the other Polynesian islands. You see the coco bra, the grass skirt, all the stuff, the fire dancer, the big headpieces, all the stuff being in Hawaii. So people just get that idea that that's all Hawaiian dancing. So then when they start learning the dance in class, they're like, oh, there are two different things, you know, completely different styles. And I feel like I have that responsibility to those Polynesian cultures that I am portraying, that it has to be the right way. So I do try to do my best to keep it as authentic and respectful as possible.
Learning a lot of this stuff directly from Hawaiians, Tahitians. We teach that to our dancers, that these are the movements, these are the teachings we were taught, and in most Polynesian cultures, it's a gift, so you pass that gift on.
Acevedo and Gabino say their students, who come from all over the Chicago area, often have a personal connection to Polynesian culture that leads them to seek out Hokulea.
I just received a call yesterday from a dancer who, born and raised in Hawaii, he's lived here in Chicago for 5 years and he misses home. And so for him, it's more about the camaraderie, the fellowship, that ohana, that family sense.
But whether the dancers come from Hawaii, Mexico, or Chicago, and whether they learned those steps on a tropical island or in Jefferson Park, the story Hokulea tells always returns to love.
When I do get to see him dance, like I'm just like in love. I'm like that. I feel like that's something that connects us anyway. Like it's not home, but it feels like home.
That's the cool part, that we get to do the business, but we also get to perform together. The love is real and it's deep. We can share what we have with others through dance. It's pretty cool.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Erica Gunderson.
Gabino and Acevedo say they can teach anyone those moves, so if you're up to the challenge, you'll find more on our website. Amanda, I'm sure you're up to the challenge, and we go back to you.
Thanks, Paris. Yes, definitely. We've got to give that a hip-moving shot. Now, here is still to come on Chicago Tonight. The Chicago Board of Elections says 90% of the city's polling places are accessible, but disability advocates disagree. Alderman Ray Lopez drops out of the race for mayor with a stinging attack on the incumbent. Our Spotlight Politics team on that and more. And with the holiday season kicking off, we take a look back at our visit to a poinsettia farm in Woodstock. But first, some more of today's top stories. The man accused of carrying out a mass shooting over the weekend at an LGBTQ Colorado nightclub will remain held without bond. 22-year-old Anderson Lee Aldrich appeared in court today via video conference. He allegedly shot and killed 5 people. More than a dozen others were injured. Formal charges against the suspect are expected to be announced during his next court appearance. Immunization for the measles is at an all-time low. A record high 40 million children missed a vaccine dose last year. That's according to the World Health Organization and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The organizations say kids getting measles doses has dropped significantly since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Worldwide, there were about 9 million measles infections last year and 128,000 deaths. If you want to be on time for turkey and pumpkin pie, make sure you leave early. That's what AAA is advising Thanksgiving travelers this year. This week's holiday travel is expected to be the highest since 2015. AAA is forecasting nearly 2.8 million Illinoisans will travel 50 miles or more during the holiday. That's slightly higher than national figures. And also about 38,000 more Illinois travelers than last year. Those hoping to keep late Mayor Harold Washington's legacy alive held an annual wreath-laying ceremony at Oakwood Cemetery today. This year marks the 35th anniversary of his death. Washington became Chicago's first black mayor in 1983. And now, Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. People with disabilities are having a bit tougher time casting their election ballot. That's because an internal analysis from the Chicago Board of Elections found that less than 10% of polling places were compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Elections Board says that doesn't necessarily mean that most of those are inaccessible. So will the city be ready for February's municipal election? To talk about polling place accessibility are Robin Jones, project director and principal investigator at the Great Lakes ADA Center, and Bibi Novich, senior attorney for voting rights with Equip for Equality. We also invited a representative of the Chicago Board of Elections to join the conversation, but they declined. We do have a statement from them, which we will get to shortly. But first of all, we thank you both for joining us here. Robin Jones, I'll start with you. So this Board of Elections review found that less than 10% of polling places were fully ADA compliant. First of all, what does it mean to fully be in compliance with the ADA?
Well, the ADA sets forth certain standards of accessibility for a building and such. So that would mean that starting from the outside, the path of travel, getting to that, which like sidewalks, things of that nature, then parking, if there was parking available, being accessible, like accessible parking spaces. And is there a accessible path to the door? And that's somebody in a wheelchair could use. Is the door accessible? Is there a step? Is the door, can it be opened? Is the handle on the door accessible so somebody can grab it and open it who might not have hand? And able to get into it. So then once you're inside, can I actually get to the polling area? So all of these things are factors of accessibility. There's many elements.
And I think they have to have bathrooms there, fully accessible
bathrooms to the public. If the bathrooms are open to the public, yes, they would be, accessible. Yes.
Bibi Novich, what's the culprit here for such a low level of compliance?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts to add here. The information that the Chicago Board of Elections is using comes from a survey program that my organization, Equip for Equality, is managing for them. And it's pursuant to a settlement with the Department of Justice. And what our surveys do is they measure every aspect of polling sites, so buildings and everything that Robin was talking about, the sidewalks, approaching them, up against the strictly up against the ADA standards. That's the Americans with Disabilities Act standards for new construction. Now those standards don't necessarily really apply to these buildings because many of them are pre-ADA. But there is no really easy bright line standard for pre-ADA buildings. So the Department of Justice says that entities should use ADA new construction standards as a guide. But so that's why we surveyed up to the strict construction of those standards, and any tiny deviation would render them supposedly inaccessible. But still, many of them would be accessible to many people with disabilities because, for instance, if there was one bump on the sidewalk that was more than 3/4 of an inch high, which wouldn't be a barrier to many people with disabilities, including people with mobility impairments, that entire polling place would be rendered inaccessible under our survey. So it's a very high standard and not necessarily that usable for people, for the regular public to understand what the accessibility is to them.
It kind of gets to that point that we made at the top. It doesn't necessarily mean that these places are inaccessible for persons with disabilities, and I want to get to that statement from the Board of Elections. It says, quote, "The board has been working with the City of Chicago Public Schools and the Chicago Park District for years to perform remedies at inaccessible locations. While most of the board's polling places show at least one element that is not in strict compliance with ADA new construction standards, the majority of polling place locations are usable by most voters with disabilities." So, Robin Jones, if you had to guess, what percentage of polling places are usable for all persons with disabilities, even if they have maybe one little thing that doesn't make them compliant?
Well, I think from just talking with BB, because I mean I haven't done the surveys in the way that they have done the surveys, but talking to them because they do have the data, you know, from the they're saying that somewhere in the 90 to 95% would be accessible. I think it's tricky to use that term usable because usable, you know, makes some assumptions. You know, I mean everybody how they use something is totally different. So we don't tend to like to use that terminology, you know, of usable. So I think it's more the issue as, you know, is there a barrier? Is there something that would limit somebody from being able to use that space? And that limit is going to be different for everybody depending on whether there's somebody who walks on a cane, somebody who uses a wheelchair, somebody who's blind, you know. Very different.
And Bibi Novich, one of the things that the Chicago Board of Elections sort of admitted to was maybe their communication about this could have been a little better in the midterm election. So we have the municipal election coming up. They're saying they're going to clearly mark which are fully compliant, which are partially compliant, which are non-compliant. Is that going to help the problem?
Yeah, I think it'll help it a lot. And what we're going to try to do is come up with terms that are a little bit more helpful for people with disabilities who want to come and vote to understand. So we'll come up with terms that mean something more than just inaccessible or accessible. You know, we'll say which polling places, for instance, require steps and which don't, because that's obviously a very important barrier to most people with mobility impairments. And more than that, we'll have backup information because, as Robin said, different people with different disabilities may have different things that prevent them from getting in or out of a polling place. So the important thing is to have that information available to people with disabilities, detailed information, and to have the terminology that we use be helpful. And that's what we're going to be working on with the Board of Elections between now and February.
And Robin Jones, given this, are you confident that every person with a disability that wants to come cast a ballot in February will be able to do so without trouble?
No, I think that there's other barriers that we don't even talk about that are beyond just the physical accessibility of that space, because people still struggle with transportation in Chicago. So being able to get to the polling place is a huge barrier for people. So it's not just getting there, but how do I get there? So we still have a lot of inaccessible transportation in Chicago. Even getting from the bus stop to the polling place, you know, there still are barriers along our sidewalks that, you know, that can be a problem for people. And, you know, municipal elections are in the wintertime. So you talk about snow, and we could have a long conversation about snow removal, which is like a temporary issue, but it can be a huge barrier.
We did talk about that on this show, and you know, snow on sidewalks, very difficult for people with disabilities to get around. What about that, Bibi Novich? Could this be a deterrent for people who want to vote but won't be able to?
Well, certainly snow is an issue. The transportation barriers are a big problem, although I think Chicago's done a lot to make its transportation accessible, but there's still a ways to go. But I should mention that in the meantime, while we've been working with the Board of Elections, there have been several city entities, Chicago Public Schools, the Park District, the Department of Transportation, and the city itself have been making permanent renovations to their buildings that are used as polling places to make polling more accessible. So about over 400 facilities have been renovated between like June and the November election to make those polling areas more accessible.
Right.
And there's more of that that's going to be going on.
And we should note the Board of Elections will say there is also vote by mail, there's early voting, so there are ways around this, even if it isn't perfect. So our thanks to Robin Jones and Bibi Novich. Thank you so much for your expertise.
Thank you very much.
And we break down the week in politics just ahead, so please stay with us. Alderman Ray Lopez drops out of the mayoral race, but not before launching a stinging attack on the incumbent. Campaign donations from collapsed crypto trading platform FTX leave mayoral candidate Jesus Chuy Garcia with some questions to answer. And a Democratic state senator wins a narrow re-election race despite allegations of domestic violence. Here with all that and more is our Spotlight Politics team of Amanda Vinicky and Heather Sharon. Let's get right to it. You're a vision, both of you in red tonight. I didn't get the memo.
Did not plan it. But I love what happened.
I wish I had known. All right, let's start with Alderman Lopez's withdrawal from the mayor's race.
Today I made the decision to announce that I will not run for mayor because what's for the good of the city is to ensure that Lori Lightfoot is defeated and denied a second term. The odds of her getting reelected grow with every candidate that enters this race.
One less person, Heather Sharon, how does this change the dynamic?
Well, Ray Lopez was a conservative critic of the mayor, so everybody seems to think this is going to help Willie Wilson and Paul Vallis, who have also sort of staked out that conservative lane in this race. Now, Ray Lopez said he only collected about 26,000 signatures, which meant that he was likely to face a challenge, so it's not clear that he would have made the ballot to begin with. Now we wait and see what Jesus Chuy Garcia and the mayor do on Monday.
I'm confused, though. Can he file those signatures? Because he's going to run for alderman. So does he just transfer those signatures to his aldermanic race?
Nope. All along, he had to have been collecting petitions for city council and for mayor. Now, to run for alderman, you only need 500 signatures. So if you're an incumbent alderman like Alderman Lopez, that should be a pretty easy lift. But two separate petitioning processes.
A lot easier threshold than mayor's race. But by the way, Amanda, say you were a donor to Alderman Lopez. You're thinking he's going to run for mayor, and now he's got your money, assuming he hasn't spent it, and he's running for alderman. Can he just turn around and use that?
Yeah, I mean, that's generally how it goes. You see all the time campaign funds shift from one to another. As we've reported, you have a lot of elected officials using their campaign funds to pay legal fees that presumably many donors would say, hey, wait a second, I wasn't giving you money to defend what appears to be illegal activity. It's theirs. I mean, going back, actually, Illinois, you used to be able to pocket the money that donors had given you upon your retirement.
I think this was before 1997. Exactly. So the folks that have been around since before 1997, they still can pocket that money.
They can still pocket that money, the money that they'd raised before the deadline. Buy a house, buy a car, move to somewhere warm, whatever.
Palm Springs, California, perhaps, or Lake Geneva, Wisconsin.
But
not that
Ray
I know
Lopez
any
cannot do anything like that.
That have homes there.
No, of course not.
Not in Illinois. What are you talking about?
But Ray Lopez, I mean, it seems as if this was always sort of a parallel track. You've got to kind of wonder, all right, how much did he recognize? Perhaps he didn't have that great of a chance at winning the mayoral race, wanted to keep a spot in elected office in Chicago.
Well, like
and hold
Heather
on to
said,
his
there's going to be petition challenges if you don't have like 40,000 signatures, like 3 times the required amount. So with the amount he had, he was definitely going to face a challenge. By the way, Heather, who is going to face a challenge that is going to file, do you think?
Well, this is just speculative because people have until December 5th to file those challenges. But if I were State Rep Cam Buckner, I would be a little bit nervous. I would also be a little bit nervous if I were Jamal Green. Both turned in less than 30,000 or just about 30,000 signatures, which is the threshold for your rivals to sort of take a close look at each of those petition streets. A little bit of ancient history now. Back in 2019, Jamal Green ran for mayor, was ousted from the ballot by Willie Wilson. So they're both running again. So will we see that fight happen again? Maybe it's going to be a free-for-all.
They might be gearing up for that right now. Chuy Garcia, he announced he's running. He hasn't turned his petitions yet. Does anyone doubt he's going to have enough signatures to get on the ballot?
He did get a late start in this endeavor, and this sometimes, yes, you need allies, you need workers. Garcia has all of those. He has funding to be able to get it done, but it is a matter of time, and if you've signed somebody else's petition, then you can't have somebody else. So let's say, Paris, I know I personally don't sign any because I'm a journalist, but let's pretend in a fake world that you were trying to be kind, do a public service, because just because you sign a petition does not, of course, obligate you to vote for that individual in an election. But you signed that of, let's say, I don't know.
Sophia King.
Sophia King. You signed Sophia King's petition, and then you are a supporter of Garcia's in this alleged scenario. You could not sign his petition. So
that
it
petition will
is
get
difficult
invalidated
for him.
in
He's
a
going
challenge.
to have to, but he knows this. Presumably, he has the political organization to clear that hurdle. And you would think he wouldn't have entered the mayor's race unless he had a plan to get over
Sometimes we see signatures like Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck, just completely fake signatures, which is why it is difficult to meet that threshold. Speaking of Chuy Garcia.
By the way, and candidates pay money. I mean, this
to
is
the
not all
people
volunteers.
passing the petitions
people passing
around.
petitions.
And they
sometimes
pay
get
better money to ones that do a better job getting real signatures as opposed to fake
they'll
signatures.
look for quality.
This is a whole industry.
As well as quantity. Yes, it is.
All right, speaking of Chuy Garcia, we had him on for an interview last night. We brought up some donations that he got from an independent expenditure group funded by fallen FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried. He's been in the news all over the place lately. It had given about $200,000 to Garcia's congressional campaign. Fried also gave Garcia an individual donation, which Garcia then said he gave to charity. So here's what Garcia said about that last night.
The support that was provided was in the form of an independent expenditure. We had no control, no coordination, no knowledge of it until we saw that it was taking place in the district. The $2,500 were returned and given to a charity.
This was his individual contribution to
Exactly.
You return that.
Yes. I have a strong history of being very skeptical about cryptocurrencies. I think they ought to be regulated very closely. I've been a fierce advocate on that.
So this crypto stuff is kind of confusing, Heather, but Garcia is on a House working group coming up with regulations for the crypto industry. Could this Bankman-Fried connection come back to haunt him at all?
Sure. We don't know what federal regulators and federal prosecutors are going to find as they investigate the collapse of FTX. I will say the strange thing about the contribution to Garcia is that Garcia was essentially unopposed in his bid for another term in Congress. So you typically don't see large independent expenditures in races that are essentially sure to go one way or the other. But I should say that Garcia was not the only congressional candidate in Illinois.
No, Bankman-Fried has had his tentacles in Chicago politics. We know national politics, specifically Democrats, but Chicago politics too.
Jonathan Jackson, who is now he's the elect in the 1st district, he got a $500,000 independent expenditure that went towards television ads. Also in downstate, Nikki Budzinski, who's now the congressperson-elect down there, she also got $263,000 from Bankman-Fried's political action committee. So he clearly had a goal and was making his weight thrown around in Illinois politics.
Well, I think I was yesterday years old when I relearned that FTX very briefly had a headquarters in Chicago, and Mayor Lightfoot was at a groundbreaking for an announcement they were making to give money to a local charity.
Yeah, that's right. They were going to spend $600,000 on a private guaranteed basic income program. Now, we know the city and the county are doing their own. This was a separate one. That program is now in the lurch because the rest of that money doesn't exist.
Keywords there. We're going to.
And I know that they're still trying to maybe make up for that shortfall now. I mean, this is just a very intriguing story that I know is going to keep developing. Let's move over to some state politics. Amanda, a Democratic State Senator Michael Hastings, he wins a narrow re-election race, and our viewers might remember the name Hastings because he's been caught up in some very severe domestic abuse allegations. What Governor Pritchard's called for his resignation. Is he definitely going to take a seat for another term?
It appears so. He has shown no signs of standing down from his election for those calls asking him to step down, including, of course, as you noted, by some key Democratic leaders. He doesn't have to. Voters chose him. Again, even as all of this was very public and very well known, came out well in advance of the election, and had an opponent who was not an afterthought. Sometimes in races you might have just somebody running for the sake of having a name on the ballot. No, this was a well-funded campaign from somebody who had the support, including, for example, the Chicago FOP had backed Patrick Sheehan. So, no, he won this race outright, and he's shown no signs of stepping down. He has denied a lot of the allegations that have come out, including court records from his now ex-wife.
And there's some really interesting goings-on in another state representative race in DuPage County, where the incumbent Republican Deanne Mazzochi is challenging the vote count. The state Supreme Court just issued a ruling on this. Get us up to speed on what's happening here.
So we know that in the Illinois House, Democrats gained on their supermajority. What we are not 100% sure of is by how many seats, and that is because of this outstanding race that, as you noted, is in DuPage County, so covering parts of Clarendon Hills, Elmhurst, Tinsdale, Downers Grove, Oak Brook. And you have an incumbent Republican, Deanne Mazzochi, who, if anybody pays attention to Springfield, you will know her. She is a lawyer who is not afraid to speak her mind. Some would say combative. She would say, I think, sticking up for her constituents and voters. She's been in office since 2018. But of course, we have shifting districts drawn by Democrats. And so this is one of those races where the GOP knew it was going to be tough. At last count, the Democrat in this race, who is Jennifer Douglass Laddish, also an attorney, she is ahead. But there's been some really interesting stuff here, Paris, as you noted, including the Illinois Supreme Court even getting involved in terms of how these mail-in ballots are being counted, with the DuPage County clerk, who is a Democrat, won re-election, kind of interestingly, by the way, against former Governor Bruce Rauner's Lieutenant Governor Evelyn Sanguinetti. She tried to be the DuPage County clerk.
Well, what's the legal issue here, and is that gonna affect the vote count?
Well, so the legal issue is still being fought out, and Mazzochi alleges that it has, and this has to do with how you determine the validity of mail-in ballots. That the clerk, Mazzochi alleges, was wrongly using people's applications, their signatures on their applications for a vote-by-mail ballot versus their signature when they first registered to vote, whenever that may have been. And Mazzochi says that's what you're supposed to use. She took that fight to the courts. The courts have agreed that that is how it is to be done. So this is something that you could see Mazzochi continuing to fight for, because this is so close.
Wait, so the
and
courts
we know that
decided against the clerk in DuPage County?
Correct.
Okay, so that could maybe change the outcome of the race?
I mean, we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know.
And
this is all fairly
like you said,
new.
this is only, within a couple hundred votes.
A couple hundred votes, and by the way, all of those mail-in ballots were being counted, and if they arrived at the clerk's office up until yesterday, they would be counted. So this is sort of a new territory, with Mazzochi saying that she's trying to uphold the election integrity process, the Laddish saying that she's going to accept the results of the election, whatever they come to pass.
Okay, well, we're going to keep following. Now let's move to the city level. Heather, Carrie Austin, the alderwoman who's outgoing from the 34th Ward. She is under indictment, faces a possible trial soon. She says she's too ill to stand trial. What happens now?
Well, she told the federal court that she plans to retire on March 1st. Now, that date is interesting because it is one day after the first round of voting on February 28th. So it is essentially saying, I'm too sick to stand trial, because she was supposed to be back in court next week, but she's too ill, she says, to come. She's also too ill, she says, to attend city council meetings. She has been using supplemental oxygen therapy during those meetings. She says she's unable to walk long distances. So the question is, if she's too ill to stand trial, why is she still fit to serve the residents of the 35th Ward, or 34th Ward?
Let's remind viewers, 34th Ward is drastically going to change. So right now it's far south side around Roseland. It's going to be moving to the downtown area, so there's going to be a completely new crop of candidates for that. But, so she's going to step down March 1st, 2 months before a new city council sits. Is Mayor Lightfoot going to appoint an interim for that 2 months?
Well, she could, and the idea would be that the new alderperson of the 21st Ward, which is basically going to take up the current 34th Ward, would then be appointed to serve that remaining term, and then move over to the 21st Ward once the new term starts in May. The question is, again, who is representing the people of the 34th Ward right now? According to Carrie Austin herself, she's too sick to do it. I think that raises real questions about governance in Chicago, especially in an area of the city that has seen such deep disinvestment for so many decades.
No one's ever had questions about governance in Chicago, Heather. This must be a first.
Yes.
Happy Thanksgiving to both of you. I know you have wonderful plans for tomorrow, and enjoy the long weekend. All right. And that's our Spotlight Politics for tonight. Up next, a local source of bright holiday blooms. But first, we take a look at the weather.
If you're planning to spend this holiday weekend looking for a Christmas tree, don't forget about another seasonal favorite, the poinsettia. The holiday flowers are actually shrubs native to Mexico. Most of the ones we see come from California, but there are some greenhouses in Illinois that cultivate them. We visited one in Woodstock a few years back. Here's another look. Bob Colsey begins to fashion a wreath with the dexterity of someone who spent a lifetime working with evergreens. His dad actually got his start in 1949 selling lilacs from a farm stand. It's been flowers and then Christmas trees ever since. Together, they built this greenhouse in Woodstock from scratch. But it wasn't until 2003 that they began to grow all of this, a sea of poinsettias, and not just your run-of-the-mill reds.
These here winter rose right here I think are one of the most unique because it's actually a poinsettia it has a double brack. If you notice, it looks like rosebuds. It's called winter rose, and it's just different. I think people like them because they're different.
Others look marbled, speckled, dipped, and dyed.
Ruby Frost, Green Envy, Ice Punch, Burgundy, some hybrid, Pink Ruffles, Jingle Bell Rock, and Polly Pink.
Colsey's favorite.
That red glitter where it looks like God has just sprinkled it with white paint. And he's like, I'll do it this way and I'll do it that way. And I think that I can't get enough of that.
Selling poinsettias, that's common enough this time of year. But growing them, that's a whole different matter. Colsey's used to ship them in.
We decided the quality wasn't quite good enough for what we wanted to do for our customers. So we decided we're going to tackle a new crop, being the poinsettias. So we had to teach ourselves how to grow them.
Each July, Colsey gets 5,000 cuttings, plants about 2 inches tall. Then he and his crew spend from summer through Thanksgiving tending them. That's no easy chore. And it is a chore. Colsey says they're the most demanding plant he grows.
We gotta trim them, we gotta pinch them, we gotta space them, we gotta speed them up, we gotta slow them down, we gotta turn up their heat. Oh, turn down their heat. Oh, the bugs are attacking them. They don't be like, oh, we can wait, a couple days and do that. No, we need to be after it.
The trick isn't just keeping them alive. The team has to cultivate the crop so it's at its fullest, brightest, and boldest around the holidays. Also, customers like Bev Tixon will be stunned.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's for her mother.
And the color, it's like a rainbow of holiday out there. So when you look, it's just it's gorgeous.
Reaching this point requires getting the temperature just right. Colsey hangs thermometers from a toggle system so they can rise with the poinsettias as they grow, and they're watered from underneath so their growth isn't disturbed.
There's a lot of similarities between plants and people. If you give a person everything they want, or if you give a plant everything he wants, he kind of grows wild and he doesn't have discipline. If you take away his water, he might stay a little shorter, a little stockier. I turn down your temperature. I think people, if they're put through some trials and tribulations, I think that builds their character, and that's how I grow these plants. I build them and I grow them and I look at them. You're too short, I'm going to make you bigger. You're too tall, I'm going to chill you out. I grow the plants like I think life can be.
For all of that, Colsey promises they're easy enough to tend to once you get one home. Colsey's recommends watering your poinsettia weekly. A guide is on the Chicago Tonight website. Keep them in natural or artificial light, somewhere where it's between 60 and 70 degrees ideally, and away from any draft, hot or cold. Then keep disturbance to a minimum.
So what it means to you, if you brought a poinsettia home, set it, make sure it's the way you like it, leave it. Its job is just to sit and look pretty.
Set it and forget it.
Set and forget.
If you're worried about having a poinsettia and a pet, Colsey says no need to worry. A cat would have to eat 50 pounds of the leaves, a dog 100, in order for it to be toxic. Come January, Colsey will clear out vestiges of the holiday from his greenhouse. Any remaining poinsettias will become compost. In July, a new batch of poinsettia cuttings will arrive, and a little bit of holiday cheer will once again take root. The colorful part of a poinsettia, by the way, isn't the flower. The spear-like colored leaves, or bract, surround the flower. As for the debate over how to actually pronounce the plant, we asked Bob Colsey about that. He says it's whatever the customer wants to call it, but he prefers poinsettia, so that's what we went with. But authoritative sources do insist it is poinsettia.
That's what I went with.
Yeah, I went with poinsettia, but either way, they're pretty. Now, by the way, Colsey caught up with him briefly today. He tells us that the greenhouse is now selling a smaller version of poinsettia as well. We'll be back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing and get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. Chicago Tonight is off tomorrow for the holiday, but please join us Friday night at 7 for the Week in Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Amanda Vinicky.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Have a safe and happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you.
Thank you, Paris.
And we'll see you Friday.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.